So I got a bunch of different wild updates here that I want to get to with you guys in regards to Russia and Putin and Biden and Democrats, Republicans, the assassination of political rivals, as well as allegations of space nukes. So it's a lot of different moving pieces to this, but let's just go ahead and jump into it. So the latest here is that from NBC News, the Biden administration is set to impose major new sanctions to hold Russia accountable for Navalny's death. Okay, so this guy, Alexei Navalny, was basically an anti-Putin figure within Russia, who the West, including the United States, had somewhat of an affinity for, right? I think that they saw him as a useful tool to try to, put some sort of uncomfortable pressure on Vladimir Putin. And obviously, Putin didn't like this guy, so much so to the point where, in all likelihood, he assassinated him. Now, this guy had previously been poisoned. Okay, I think in all likelihood, again, by Vladimir Putin or people who he had ordered to poison him, and obviously felt that he was enough of a threat or a thorn in his side that he felt the need to go ahead and do this. So, I mean, obviously, there's no 100% confirmation that this was Vladimir Putin's doing, although their explanation for how this happened with Navalny is that he died from sudden death syndrome. Sudden death syndrome. I mean, the only context that I'm aware of, like, sudden death syndrome is usually with, like, infants or babies, where something can go catastrophically wrong and then they die suddenly. But sudden death syndrome, could we really not have come up with a better excuse here? I mean, this is really what we're going with, sudden death syndrome, but okay. Anyways, Navalny ends up dying. Right? And so the Biden administration steps in. They say this is totally unacceptable, which, I mean, obviously killing political rivals or opponents is unacceptable in any reasonable society, even if I don't agree with Navalny's politics, which I don't to a large extent. I don't think there's much daylight between his politics versus Putin politics. It's not as if Navalny is some, like, a radical lefty socialist or something like that, or, super, like, pro-democracy guy or whatever the West wants to make him out to be. I mean, questionable politics to say the least, but again, that's irrelevant to the fact that you shouldn't be killed in any country for being an opposition figure to the established ruling figure in the country, right? And so he ends up being killed, or I guess dying suddenly, and now the Biden administration is imposing sanctions because that's totally unacceptable, right? Now, I just want to say first off, guys, that obviously we have been imposing drastic sanctions on Russia since their invasion of Ukraine. So have many other countries around the world who are allies with the United States. And, although I do think that these have had some impact, I mean, maybe the biggest impact is that a lot of these wealthy Russians can't really go to the United States to go vacation on their super yachts or whatever. That's probably had some sort of an impact with the wealthy people who are surrounding Putin and, are within the upper echelons of Russian society. But just in a broad sense, in terms of whether or not the sanctions have worked to stop Putin's invasion of Ukraine, they haven't. I mean, obviously the invasion is ongoing, the war is ongoing. It doesn't seem like there's much of an end in sight, although with all of the Ukraine aid that is currently being held up right now, it's a huge question mark as to whether or not this war can even go on for that much longer. But I mean, I don't think that the United States has played a good role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine so far. And what I mean by that is, like, at this point, we're years into this. The front lines don't seem to be changing much. If anything, there was just a massive retreat by Ukraine in one of their strongholds, and it doesn't seem like they're advancing significantly, right? It would be one thing if they were rolling over Russian troops and it looked like they were on the trajectory to take back, rightfully, I think, every inch of Ukrainian territory or whatever. But that's just not the reality of what is going on. We have given them tens of billions of dollars in weapons and aid, and it just doesn't seem to be doing much. And the longer that time goes on, the more likely it is that we're going to have thousands and thousands of more people dead. I mean, there have been hundreds of thousands of troops that have been killed and injured on both sides of this equation. Thousands of civilians who have been killed and injured, immense destruction to infrastructure inside of Ukraine. So it's been a fucking disaster, right? And at some point, there's only a couple ways that this war can end, right? I think it's definitive at this point that Ukraine is not logistically going to be able to militarily take back every inch that Russia has invaded. And so it's either going to end with them sort of running out of weapons at the end of the day, and then Russia conquering the rest of the territory, or it's going to end in some sort of a negotiated settlement. And so obviously I think the negotiated settlement is the better way to go out of those options, and should have been pushed for more aggressively a long time ago. The United States was not in favor of that approach, and so we've just sort of been sending dump loads of weapons to them, and more people just end up dying, right? And so it's been a clusterfuck, it's been a disaster, and I don't think that the sanctions have broadly been successful in bringing about any sort of like serious damage to Russia's ability to wage this war on Ukraine. And they have way more men. I mean, they have, the Ukrainian side of this equation is now trying to rely on, in some cases, like 40, 50, even older men to fight this war. Millions of people have been forced out of Ukraine to flee Ukraine. I mean, it is such a disaster at this point. So the war, I think, needs to come to an end at some point. There's going to be uncomfortable negotiations. Nobody's going to be happy with them, but that's unfortunately the reality of the situation, at least as I see it, right? And so we have the Biden administration, right, imposing these sanctions on Russia for killing Navalny. Now, the second aspect that I want to talk about, aside from Russia's war, is the utter hypocrisy here from the United States that I think is on full display. To sanction Russia, not only for their invasion of Ukraine, but also, for the killing of opposition leaders, at the same time as we are increasing, or at least attempting to increase, weapons shipments to the tune of upwards of $14 billion to Israel, as they are in the midst of an ICJ case saying that they are plausibly in the midst of committing a genocide with the weapons that we are giving them. And we continue to give them weapons, as we see an endless string of IDF war crimes on a daily basis for over 4 months now. And so to impose sanctions on Russia for an illegal invasion of Ukraine, but to not only not impose sanctions on Israel for a genocidal campaign inside of Gaza, but to actually send them more weapons, it's just utterly ridiculous. It exposes the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy. If you happen to be a geopolitical rival or an enemy of ours, then we will point out all of the human rights abuses that you do commit, right? Or the illegal acts of war that you commit. But if you are one of our closest allies, then we will defend you on the global stage, we'll veto UN resolutions, we will give you diplomatic cover, we will send you more weapons, we will do all of these things, right? Same goes for Saudi Arabia. I mean, yes, Putin in all likelihood killed Navalny. It's despicable, right? Regardless, again, whether or not I agree with his politics. But what do we do in response to Saudi Arabia dismembering Jamal Khashoggi, an American journalist who worked for the Washington Post? What do we do in response to that? I mean, Joe Biden went over to Saudi Arabia, gave Mohammed bin Salman a fist bump, okay, as we continue to arm Saudi Arabia, same as the Trump administration did. So when it's our allies, there's no consequences. When it's our enemies, oh, you betcha there's going to be fucking consequences. We're going to pull out all of the stops and accuse you of every single international crime in the books. And even in some cases like this, where it's potentially justified, it exposes how little of an actual principled underlying approach that the United States has. And so I think that's pretty clear. Now, another aspect of this. So the United States, this stemmed from like a Republican who came out and had some sort of backroom information that was given to him by the intelligence community or whatever, some report that he got his hands on. And he came out and he leaked this and he said, there is a massive national security threat that I just learned about. This needs to be declassified so every member of Congress can have a look at it, whatever. And it turns out that the story is that Russia is launching space nukes. They're launching space nukes, guys, apparently, right? And so, I think it's pretty transparent what this story is about. So this just so happened to coincidentally, apparently, come out and coincide with the heated debates around whether or not to reauthorize FISA, right? This ability for the government, the intelligence communities, whatever, to do warrantless surveillance of American citizens, right? And so there was all this pressure, and it seems like this story kind of dropped right when the pressure was building on whether or not that kind of a vote would take place to reauthorize FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and, kind of just in a fear-mongering way, right? Look at the big, bad, scary Russians. They're going to nuke us from space, and so, of course, we have to have these unconstitutional abilities for the American government to warrantlessly spy on the American people. It's all for safety. It's all for protection from the scary Russian space nukes. In terms of logistics on this, guys, when they say this, I mean, maybe the underlying accusation here that Russia is planning to have nukes in space or something is, maybe that's true. But the reality is that, listen, guys, and this is a point that, Crystal and Sagar made today on Breaking Points. The actual logistics of space, right, make it so that already right now, we have the ability, China has the ability, Russia has the ability, every major country that has satellites in space has the ability to fuck up the entirety of what is currently orbiting around the Earth right now. Right? We could send satellites off of their current trajectory and have them crash into other satellites. We could send weapons up there to destroy certain countries' satellites. We could disable them. We could try to, manipulate them in any way that we want. This is sort of like another mutually assured destruction logic that we use when we're talking about having nukes in the first place on Earth. And that goes without even having these nukes inside of space, as they're alleging here. And so I think that a lot of this is just fear-mongering. I don't think that this is like part of some broader plot of Russia to nuke us from space. They could nuke us from the ground if they wanted to. We could also nuke them from the ground. We have our two countries combined already have enough nukes to completely obliterate the entirety of the world's population multiple times over. So I don't understand what the point of that is, other than just sort of continued fear-mongering, trying to justify the expansion of FISA and the reauthorization of FISA, as well as trying to perpetuate, of course, the standard U.S. military funding. We have to spend $1 trillion a year on the military, even though the Pentagon can't pass an audit because the Russians are going to attack us with these space nukes any day now. So, I mean, I think that's kind of the gist of what I got from that story. Now, moving on here, I wanted to talk about this little conversation with Jen Psaki and Nancy Pelosi, where they are sort of doubling down on what has previously been referred to as the Russiagate conspiracy, that Putin, has some P-tapes on Trump, or has some financial leverage over Trump, and he's a Manchurian candidate, and all of this and that. So let's go ahead and watch them. They're sort of like continuing with that idea here.
Putin has on him. I mean, it sure seems like something, as you've said a few times, given that he refuses to criticize him, that he seems to be a fanboy of him. Are you worried at all?
During the Mueller...
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, first of all, we must be sure that he does not step one foot into the White House, not as president or not as anything. He has brought disgrace to the White House, to these presidents. I talked about George Washington. It's also President's Week for Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln died, it was embroidered in his coat that night at that theater, one country, one destiny. And he gave his life to unify our country. And now we have someone who had the honor of serving in the White House, didn't consider it an honor, didn't consider his oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution. And on this week, speaking out the way he did about Navalny shows you that he is a person without values. He looks like he's going to be a person without dollars either, but the values are what concern us.
Yes, the dollars.
So I don't know what he has on him, but I think it's probably financial. Either something financial he has on him or something on the come.
Okay. What did she say there at the end? Okay, I'm gonna try to move past that here. Now, first off, I mean, in terms of Trump being in financial trouble, yeah, probably. The 450 million some odd judgment that came against him for his New York business fraud, the 83 million from the E. Jean Carroll case. Yeah, he's kind of like financially being destroyed right now, and that's before we get into any of the criminal indictments that he is facing right now, like 95 different charges that are currently against him. So in that sense, she's not wrong. In terms of whether or not Putin directly has financial leverage over Trump, I mean, didn't we kind of go through all of this already? Didn't we kind of push this idea as far as we possibly can and had a bunch of investigations and all of that? Now, granted, a lot of Trump allies did end up getting arrested, but that wasn't necessarily for Vladimir Putin owning them and having, direct financial collusion with Donald Trump. So I'm just is this really the direction that we want to go? Continuing this, especially even just politically, how this is interpreted by the American people at this point, outside of diehard MSNBC Jen Psaki fans, the idea that Trump is a Manchurian candidate who's in the pocket for Putin. I mean, keep in mind, guys, Trump was not policy-wise, right? He may go out there and sort of rhetorically cozy up to a bunch of different authoritarians around the world because he's also a wannabe authoritarian. He may do that rhetorically, but in terms of actual policy, he was not going easy on Russia, right? And in terms of like NATO policy as well, he flip-flops on that all the time, as he does with many of his other policies, right? His main issue with NATO right now seems to be that he thinks that other NATO allies are not putting enough money into NATO. And at the same time, then he'll come out later and he'll give a press conference where he's talking about how, Putin can go ahead and attack NATO. But also, again, he's attaching onto that his underlying reasoning for that is that he wants NATO members to pay more into NATO. So is he pro-NATO? Does he think that Putin should be able to attack NATO? It's all kind of just incoherent nonsense, right? And, this is the same guy, Trump, as well, who, if you guys remember, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what did he say? He said something like, we should paint the Chinese flag on American planes and go and bomb Russia and then try to blame it on China, right? So this is a guy who, and also he had that other quote, right, where he was saying, I would end the Ukraine war in one day. Now, did he say, Ukraine should give up everything and just hand it over to Putin in a way that you would expect a Manchurian, Putin-backed candidate to do? No, he didn't say that. Basically, what he said was a complete 180 of two different statements. He said, number one, Putin should basically give in. And on the other side, he said, if Ukraine does not come to the table to negotiate in good faith, then we're going to cut off the weapons from them. And if Putin doesn't come to the table in good faith, then we're going to give Ukraine every single weapon and going to destroy Russia. So it's like he always talks out of both sides of his mouth because he doesn't have any real core underlying beliefs there, I think, right? Other than his just general authoritarian tendencies and his monstrously gargantuan ego, right? And so I think that this is, it's kind of a waste of time. It comes across as pretty silly. And I don't think that it's going to be effective, right? Now, part of this story as well is that this recently came out, and I didn't get to talk about this on the channel at the time, but there was this guy who was a major figure in Republicans' attempts to impeach Joe Biden over this alleged Ukrainian corruption and how Hunter was profiting off of this business with Burisma, and Joe Biden was getting kickbacks in some form or another, and whatever generalized corruption, whether it's with Ukraine ties or Chinese ties or whatever the case may be. And one of the key figures that Republicans were relying on as a part of making this impeachment case was this one guy who ended up getting arrested for lying to the feds about Hunter Biden, and then claimed that he got fake information from Russian intelligence. So, this is going to definitely feed into the, Democrat focus on Russia and the Republican Party and Trump and all of that stuff, right? So, it is kind of funny because this was one of the main witnesses, this star witness that Republicans were putting forward, and all of the claims that he made have now been essentially deemed ineligible because he was caught lying to the feds about a lot of this and making a lot of this up. So in terms of the impeachment, listen, guys, obviously Hunter Biden is corrupt. He was trading on his dad's name. He got jobs that he otherwise would never have been qualified to possibly have gotten. He profited off of that personally. But the impeachment standard is you got to commit, high crimes and misdemeanors, right? And they have no evidence that Joe Biden directly was profiting from any of that. And that's what you would need to actually impeach Joe Biden off of that. So yeah, is Hunter Biden kind of a piece of shit? Is he also, kind of a badass in some ways? A little bit, he's out there smoking crack sometimes in his past and, hanging out with sex workers and things like that. So in some way you got to respect it. But in other ways, yeah, he's a piece of shit. He's kind of like a fail son for Joe Biden. And, so all of that can be true, and Hunter can be corrupt in trading on his dad's name at the same time that you don't have any evidence that Joe Biden was directly participatory in this in a way that would be actually actionable and impeachable. So this was also a funny update that I thought there. And so we also had this quote that I thought was kind of interesting and funny from Joe Scarboro. And I think that the only reason I was going to bring this up is because this is the network, the show specifically with Morning Joe, that apparently, according to behind the scenes reports, is Joe Biden's favorite show to watch. And he watches this every morning and he listens to what Mika and Joe have to say here, and I guess bases a lot of what he's doing on that in kind of a similar way to how Trump used to do with Sean Hannity and a lot of the Fox News programs. And so here's what Joe Scarborough said about Republicans who are holding up aid and all of this and that. He said, Republicans for the past 50 years have been the main force to push back hard on communism. They've now surrendered to the communists. It is the Republican Party, once the bulwark against communist aggression, Ronald Reagan's old party, that has now collapsed. So, kind of alarming that Joe Biden's favorite morning show that he watches all the time, apparently, and takes seriously, is from this former Republican congressman here, Joe Scarborough, who is hearkening back and dreaming of the olden days of Ronald Reagan. Like that's what he would want the current Republican Party to strive for. Just like a rabid anti-communism, free market capitalist sort of like neoliberal dystopia. Okay, is what Joe Scarboro is hoping for. And this is apparently who Joe Biden is watching on a daily basis here. And so, in terms of the actual substance of this, I really don't think that there is much. There are Republicans who are posturing against Ukraine aid right now. I don't even think for the right reasons. I think it's because, they have more of a part of their base, a huge segment of their base that is against giving this money to Ukraine. It's not as if they're doing this out of some sort of an anti-war principled stance, because they're simultaneously aggressively in favor of giving money to Taiwan and to Israel and all of that. So it's not from a principled anti-war stance outside of maybe like Rand Paul or something, who is against all of this aid. But the idea that Republicans have surrendered to communists, these are the same Republicans who called Joe Biden a communist. They're so anti-communist that they think anybody to the left of Ronald Reagan himself is a communist, okay, and is trying to do some sort of an evil, scary, socialist takeover of the United States of America. So I thought that was funny. Now I'll go ahead and finish it off there. So, in terms of where we go from here, I don't know. Maybe we're about to get, nuked from space by Russia, I guess, according to the allegations. But, in all seriousness, guys, obviously, Navalny's death, I think that's somewhat important. I don't think that he was going to, topple Putin in any, legitimate fashion. Again, not the greatest guy based on what I've seen about some of his previous comments, specifically about, Muslims or whatever the case may be. But at the same time, he's a complex figure. Many people in Russia saw him as a sort of resistance figure to Vladimir Putin, and obviously Putin took him seriously enough that he poisoned him and then later, forced him to suffer from sudden death syndrome, and now he's dead. And so the Biden administration is going to ramp up the sanctions that don't seem to have been largely effective in ending the war in Ukraine. And, at the same time, sort of Democrats leaning in to the anti-Russian hawkishness, and you have essentially both parties of the on either side of the political spectrum, picking their different global baddies, right? I guess with Democrats, it's more so Russia, Putin are the baddies that we need to gear up our military to maybe inevitably go to war with. With Republicans, it seems to be much more like China is the big baddie, or even Mexico in some circumstances, saying we should go to war with Mexico and the drug cartels. Obviously both parties kind of hate Iran and are ready to go to war with Iran, or at least take pot shots at them. It's absolutely just a clusterfuck of hawkishness and, people who dream of war when they go to sleep at night. And, I don't think that it's heading in a positive direction, to say the least.